Welcome to the Data Cloud Podcast, Travis. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Dana.
Hey, tell us about your role at Paramount Global, your background in quantitative research, media analytics, and media optimization.
Absolutely. So here at Paramount, I lead advanced advertising, which is a great way to describe data-driven advertising. So it's everything from Vantage, which is our audience targeting platform, to measurement innovation, identity strategy, kind of all the sort of hard nuts and bolts of the data area. Personally, like my personal background is I actually was a data scientist for a little while, worked at a consulting firm, and ultimately moved into product roles, joined Paramount to lead product here for advanced advertising, and now I run the function.
Terrific. Hey, what excites you about the next 5 years in your area of expertise? What has sort of got you jazzed and happy to get up on Monday morning?
So right now, I think especially in the media industry, and especially for publishers like Paramount, right, who for a very long time had a very specific way of operating that's been highly disrupted through really a couple of things, right? Changing consumer behavior from a movement from linear consumption to a streaming consumption pattern, as well as new entrants into the market, right, from the big social platforms and things like that. As a result, the industry has been in immense amounts of change. I think anybody that sort of has been around it has seen that. And I think that's what the most exciting part of this is change brings an opportunity to do new things, to innovate, to try new things. And I think that's really what the most exciting part of my role is the ability to come in here and try to solve novel problems.
Hey, and how is Paramount setting itself up for the long game, and how various analytics technologies and AI in particular will help automate, enhance, and better customize ads across various media?
Look, one of the reasons I love Paramount and I love working here is that Paramount has had like a long belief that data technology capability is really critical to competition in the new world, and the ability to stay in front of our competitors and the ability to stay on the top of that curve is a competitive advantage for us in the marketplace. So as we think then about the new types of technologies that are rolling out, it's up to us to always be on the forefront of that, right? For a couple of reasons. One, we certainly want to make sure that we have the best capabilities available to our clients to take advantage of to help drive the efficacy of their advertising here at Paramount. But two, it's really necessary for us in order to continue to drive our own business, to understand our own inventory, our own audiences. I think one of the things that people don't talk about outside of kind of the data corners is with the evolution of media and the evolution that we've seen into streaming and the different types of data and the richness of data you get from those digital platforms. The explosion of information around identity resolution and identity pieces across the industry. The perpetuation of linear data sets that are anchored to tens of millions of households. It's really kind of been a boon relative to, I would say, even the last several decades of data availability in the media space. Then as we think then about how companies like Paramount need to harness that, it's through technology, right? It's through things like AI, analytics, et cetera. As we look through our own journey over here, I would say that machine learning, AI, those types of capabilities have been dramatically infused throughout our business. Actually, I think at this point, every campaign that we run is at some point touched by some automated algorithm, whether that's to forecast the delivery of a particular show, or whether that's to understand the pricing implication on revenue for our yield team. All of these things are now driven by new technology.
And if you would, Travis, describe Paramount generally, and then also tell us about what parts of this large company that you're focusing these efforts at, and perhaps how that will expand or consolidate across the other units.
So I work in ad sales, right? So everything that I do is focused on advertising and how can we make the advertising experience for brands the absolute best and most effective it can be here at Paramount. We have a lot of different functions, right? This company is very large. Our core business is producing content, right? We are an entertainment company. We are designed to make people have fun or be enthralled or learn something when they sit down and watch The Big Glass in the living room with their family. As we think then about the importance of things like understanding audience, right? That spans across the entire company. And as we think then about how we're trying to think through our future roadmaps, think through how we want to use data, apply it to our business. That's becoming a broader and a broader conversation because, frankly, the types of application that we're seeing in data is no longer just relevant for marketing or for advertising or for even things like finance, right? It's sort of starting to span across the organization. And we are seeing, like, just like most folks, an acceleration of technology changing the way that most functions are done here.
And I'm sure, like most organizations these days, you don't just buy your analytics or AI solution off the shelf in a box, prepackaged and ready to go. There's a lot of customization and work that goes into it. And you mentioned Vantage. So tell us about Vantage and how you've developed that using readily available technologies, but how you also have used your own internal expertise to improve it.
Yeah, so Vantage is our audience platform. And the best way to think about what Vantage does, right, is it changes the concept of advertising from, hey, we should be focused on somebody based on their age and their gender, to we should really start to measure and optimize against people that want to buy the product that we're advertising for, right? I know it seems fairly intuitive to say, like, if you're going to buy advertisements to advertise a new cheeseburger for a QSR restaurant, perhaps you should try to understand if the people that are watching television eat cheeseburgers. But this is actually a relatively novel concept in advertising, especially in the linear space. I would say it's only about 10 years old. So a lot of what Vantage is Paramount's answer to that. How can we start to leverage data and the kind of the explosion of data available in the marketplace to give richer insights and richer capabilities to our brands and to our clients, so they can start to think about advertising in terms of things like, is this driving units coming off of my shelf, right? Are the people I'm reaching the right folks for my brand, for my category, as opposed to this feels like the right number of GRPs in a sort of demo range.
As a consumer of media and someone who's been doing it for decades, I have to say there seems to be still a ways to go in matching my interests and needs with what I actually see. And it seems to me that it's in my best interest to improve that so that I'm not watching ads that are not relevant to me at all, and that you all get better value to your sponsors and advertisers by matching. And so how will data analytics and AI help close the gap between, me watching a football game perhaps and seeing ads for something that I will never buy multiple times when I could be getting ads that will actually help me in my consumer journey? What is the technology going to do to close that gap?
I think one of the interesting things when we think about targeted advertising is that as technology is evolving and data is becoming more prolific, we also have on the counter side of that more scrutiny and more focus on things like consumer privacy, data privacy, ensuring that we're being good stewards of the type of information that's now available to us. And I would say that as a result of that, right, the need to balance capability with the consumer, it's created an environment where a lot of the ways that we apply data and technology have become increasingly complicated and increasingly complex. I'll give a great example, right? So data clean rooms, this was all the rage a few years ago. And they're still very much being deployed as kind of a de rigueur way to do this. We leverage Snowflake, we leverage a lot of partners to do this. But it really sort of answers one core challenge for us, which is, hey, in order to understand what a consumer likes, we need to basically be able to combine data from a couple of different places, right? We need to understand what they're watching on Paramount, which is data that Paramount might have. But we also need to understand what their consumer behaviors are, which is maybe a third party. We also might work directly with an advertiser that wants to leverage first party data. How are we able to connect that to maximize the advertising experience for a consumer in a privacy compliant way through technology, through things like clean rooms, through things like anonymization, tokenization, et cetera. So yeah, it's true, right? That, like, certainly the world will continue to evolve as it comes to targeted advertising. Ads will continue to become more relevant for consumers, especially for consumers that opt in for the data trade. I think one of the really interesting things about streaming is it's teaching consumers the value of kind of their attention, right?
Yes.
It's really hard to understand the value exchange that you're giving a linear data feed when it feels free, right? Like when it's a broadcast television network.
Yeah.
But when you have to sign up and somebody's like, for an extra $6 a month, we'll make all these ads go away, then you kind of understand, hey, like, I'm actually saving money because I'm watching ads and that savings can be maximized if I share my information. And
Right.
I think as that relationship becomes more apparent to the consumer, we'll see, more interest and I think maybe less trepidation around these types of applications of data.
Right.
Um, but that doesn't change the fact that we're always going like every step forward in the advertising space has to really be two steps. It has to be a step forward for capability, but it also has to be a step forward for privacy.
Sure. And I suppose you're also, you mentioned streaming, competing with a variety of different types of businesses. Some of them are platforms in of themselves. And so when traditional media like television is considered passive, where I'm sitting there for a half an hour or even considerably longer, I'm not giving you any information about what I'm interested in by how long I look at something or whether I click through on it or whether that relates to other activity that I've done. So again, how do you close the gap when you're competing with someone who's getting two-way information about a consumer in media versus many of your properties, which are still in that sort of passive mode? Is there a technology way to keep up and even surpass what some of these other platforms are able to do?
So, it's a really interesting question because Paramount, we just rolled our always on attribution product out. And the concept of that is when you buy ads from Paramount, we're going to be able to leverage data through partnerships with folks like MasterCard, EDO, Circana to show you that type of closed loop measurement, connecting with technology, connecting with data through things like clean rooms, identity resolution, et cetera. And in a lot of ways, when we look at the platforms that have a certain set of data that allows them to do that type of closed loop measurement, and we see this as a response to that. There's an interesting piece here where as we were going through to build that product, we actually had a lot of blue sky thinking that we were able to do because we had to go out and build something from scratch, right? We didn't have an existing data asset, an existing thing that we had to shoehorn into a advertiser solution. We instead could ask ourselves, if we were an advertiser, what is the solution that we'd like? And that's what we could go out and build. I would say that the focus on performance, which is really where a lot of this attribution stuff comes in, certainly is increasing in importance. We see that with the evolution of the measurement space. We see that with the evolution of buyer KPIs and sort of their overall buy strategy. But the question is what is performance, right? And you see across all of LinkedIn now, folks are asking the question, what is the sort of balance between last touch and brand building, and how should we be able to do that?
Hmm.
That's why I think places like Paramount, we have a very special place in this ecosystem because, to your point, it's somewhat the big screen in the living room is we can call it a passive experience, but it's also a co-viewing experience, right? It's also a relaxed experience. It's something where people are receptive and are looking to sort of imbibe information, whether that's storytelling from Taylor Sheridan or a 30-second creative about a new automobile. People are in the mode and are receptive for that. Combine that with the types of premium content and premium viewer experience that we can offer, and it's really a unique proposition for advertisers. Our ability then to tell the story of us, not only through a brand lens, but through a performance lens, through a consideration lens, through the lens of the entire consumer experience that we're able to impact, is increasingly critical to us from a business perspective, and it is driving certainly, I would say, investment and a lot of building with technology and data.
Yeah. So it seems, Travis, that the quality of the experience for both your advertisers and your audience is really super dependent upon the quality and breadth of the data. But unlike a factory floor where you can control all your machines, your data is not coming from your own domain, so to speak. So you have a lot of third party data, and you have to rely on bringing that together and making it work in a common analytics environment. You could build, buy, or partner to do that. You mentioned build. How do you bring all these different data flows and even from places like a MasterCard or a Visa into your ecosystem and make it actionable?
One of the things when we look at kind of our distribution of, we'll say, like technical folks or technology folks, it's very heavily oriented at these days around data infrastructure and data connectivity. Being interoperable with our client systems is the number one most important thing, right? Because we need to meet our clients where they are, right? Which means we need to be able to build these data pipes. We need to be able to connect this data across the ecosystem. So it's a core area of focus for us, and it's an area that we've built an extreme competency in, frankly, by doing this over the last 10 years and building these types of teams and really becoming experts in this space. To pick up on one of the things you mentioned in the question, like we have to use a lot of third-party data. Sometimes, and I think it was very trendy maybe a year ago in the industry to talk about like the number of parties that your data had, if that made sense. People were talking about first party data, second party, zero party data. Like there was like all of a sudden there was like a whole gradation of these data. And it's felt like as the number of parties increased, people were like, well, this data feels less relevant or applicable. At some point, guys, third party data is just somebody else's first party data, right? It's about understanding the provenance, understanding the efficacy, and then understanding how to use it and how to connect it up in order to kind of deliver the outcomes advertisers are looking for.
Yeah. It's funny, about 10 years ago, we were talking a lot about big data. And I was at a conference and we had some automotive manufacturers on the stage. And I said, what's your big data objective? And the guy says, I don't want big data. I want all the data. And I have to assume that you're in the same boat, right?
Yeah, most certainly. And I think it's funny because if you look at the definition of big data as it's been applied to certain areas, that itself has been changing over time. 5 years ago, if you had an ACR provider or some provider that came in and said, I have 10 million households of linear viewership data, that was huge. That was a giant data set, right? Previously, we've been working on these like tiny panels that were measured in the tens of thousands. Nowadays, if that number's not over 30, it's like, what are we even doing here? And I think that is the push to the all the data aspect, right? Is that the bigger the data grows, the more obvious the fact that it's not 100% coverage becomes, and then that becomes kind of the North Star. Now, look, I'm not sure I think the pursuit is worthwhile, but I'm not sure the outcome is possible to ever have like perfect data coverage across the universe.
Right.
I also, frankly, am not sure that we want to live in a world where there's perfect data on everything about all the time and it's all real. Like that's very Orwellian, right?
Right.
But I think that what we do see is kind of this evolution of the amount of information and the size of the coverage we have. And while in a lot of ways, these big data sets kind of give us almost sometimes less visibility into some of the things that we used to have, personification is a great example, right? Like big data signals, they start at the glass, not at the sofa, in a lot of ways, what they've done is they've allowed statistical models, the data science stuff, all of these, machine learning techniques, AI, all of those things they require massive sets of information to be trained. So it's really improved, I would say, our ability to do things like forecast how many people are going to be watching South Park next week, because we just have a lot more information to use, and our data scientists can do more accurate, more exotic models, and the input or the output of all of that effort is better business.
Sure. Now, because you're relying on data from so many different sources, and that could change in a heartbeat, you might find all of a sudden a new data avenue that you want to pursue. It would be great if these all came in on a standardized basis, or there was a standard applied to just the media and advertising industry so that it would be clean and usable on arrival. But that's not yet the case. However, there's more than one way to go about standardization. Sometimes you can have 4 or 5 years of meetings and proposals and white papers and come up with an industry standard set that's then recognized and approved. Or there's the opportunity for someone to step up and say, I've got the best place to put all this. And in a way, we're standardizing by virtue of the fact that we do it better at better price and make our tools available to everybody. Openness, if you will. So do you look to Snowflake as assuming that role, and is it growing, and how beneficial is it to have a cloud source that brings in data that everybody else is using, that gives you sort of a common denominator when it comes to using the data for your analytics?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that interoperability is like a key North Star for our investment pattern. And we started working with Snowflake years ago. A large driver of that from an ad sales perspective was a lot of our clients were leveraging Snowflake, right? And we wanted to be fully interoperable with their systems. And it's done a fantastic job of allowing us to operate and to build data-driven tools in areas where we have to leverage things like clean rooms, et cetera, right? Some of these more kind of exotic technologies, due to a litany of reasons, Snowflake has been a very powerful partner for us to be able to connect data throughout that ecosystem. When I think, though, about standards, and I'll sort of use the Joint Industry Committee, which I'm very familiar with, is a good example, right? The Joint Industry Committee in the US is designed to basically evaluate transaction from various measurement data sources. One of the things that it's not doing is telling those measurement data sources, here's all the exact standards you need to follow. Because, the flip side of standardization is commoditization, right? If everything is exactly the same and it's all perfectly standardized, there's no competitive difference between anybody's products. And in that case, there's no urge to innovate. There's no reasons to build or to invest because it's a fully commoditized category. I look at how the ecosystem is evolving today, and I think it's a great blend, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, a lot of the standardization, as we would call it, is actually more about connection and interoperability, leveraging infrastructure like Snowflake, but there's still plenty of room to build custom application, custom solution to make your special sauce, right? To allow buyers and sellers to have a little bit of a different setup to frankly compete against one another. And I think that's super critical.
Yeah, and you should be focusing on those algorithms and those agents to come rather than be working the plumbing on how the data is going to assimilate and operate, right?
Exactly. I think, the standards question is always an interesting one because it's like, well, what do we want to standardize? I think that's the right question because there's certainly things we don't, right? I never want to have ad impression forecasting models totally standardized across the industry because I believe Paramount maintains a competitive advantage because we are so good at doing that, right? Mm-hmm. That being said, I also don't want to build 87 data pipelines to transfer basically the exact same information because it's coming from different companies.
Yeah.
So like there's a balance here that I think we have to maintain. To the point around Snowflake, that infrastructure layer is, I think, the right area to focus on because that's the most plumbing-y of the plumbing.
Yes. And because you've been working with Snowflake for some time, and because Snowflake looks at the media industry as a very important, dominant and important industry for them to be pursuing, what kind of stands out in your experience and how Snowflake improves your ability to know your business?
Look, I think Snowflake has done a fantastic job of enabling us to connect information, not only from our walls, but also from measurement provider walls. We have very extensive Snowflake integrations with folks like VideoAmp. It allows us to connect to our clients' data, et cetera. So it allows us to kind of build all of these things that are necessary for us to do this. But it also really is a response, I think, to the shift in the industry that happened when the platforms kind of entered. We always hear people talk about quote unquote walled gardens, right? These massive monoliths that force you to only work in their infrastructure. They don't share any data, and they don't have to. They're that big and that powerful sort of in the marketplace. When I look at Snowflake and what it enables Paramount to do, it enables us to punch above our weight, right? To be a force multiplier because instead of, we're competing with folks that have all of that data inside of their walls. And what it allows us to do is to bring similar capabilities and similar data sets to bear to our consumers or to our clients, but with a distributed infrastructure that's required for companies like ours.
All right, let's go up a few thousand feet in our vantage over your business and your vantage, and consider that a lot of organizations got into analytics vis-a-vis reporting. They just had to know what was going on and give that report to somebody in a position to make decisions. But it's evolved quite a bit from there. And so extrapolating on that, where do you see AI and analytics enabling businesses to do things differently? And I mean significantly differently. The headlines tell us how important AI is. Where do you see it going, and how has it moved from reporting to where it is now, and how does that give us some sense of where it's going to go next?
Yeah, I almost think it's like a democratization of information concept, right? So if we roll the clock back 15 years, right, BI was the thing, right? And it's all BI reporting. Microsoft Excel was sort of your most advanced tool to do this, right? It's all about spreadsheets and charts and PowerPoints. And that was a fairly democratized way to access information, right? Like if you were an analytics person, there was a set of pretty user-friendly tools that you could use to unpack data sets of what at the time were, considered large data sets. Nowadays they wouldn't necessarily be. Um, but it was like a very user-friendly way to do that, right? And we saw massive adoption across not just this industry, but all industries of those types of BI practices because people realized the power that those things could bring, right? The power that information could bring. As data and technology evolved, all of a sudden, because of the size of the data sets as well as kind of the way that they were set up, we saw a huge like kind of movement of importance away from things like very basic BI capabilities and into quote unquote data sciencey areas, right? SQL, uh, no SQL databases like Mongo, things like that. Like, there was an explosion of this.
Mm.
And also the most important thing your company could have is this amazing data science team. Because if you really wanted the best answers and the best information that set yourself apart, you needed these really technical folks that could sit there and they worked through terminals instead of UIs, right? What AI promises is to kind of mix those worlds and take the best from both, right? The power of kind of the extreme technical tools, but combined with the ease of the sort of UI experience that we used to have in the BI space. At that point, like, look, I think it's to the question around is it used for reporting? Well, I guess everything's technically a report, right? Like everything's just basically us trying to find out information to make better decisions about our business, whether that's pricing, whether that's how many units we have to run to fill a deal. Um, the thing that's changing rapidly is how that information is available, how much of that information is available, and who can find it quickly.
Do you have any use cases among your customers? And I don't expect you to name them at all, but if there are some early adopters or harbingers of what's to come, where can you look at and say this customer is doing this, or we're providing them with this and that demonstrates where this can go?
Yeah, most certainly. So when I think about our clients, right, I guess our customers, a lot of them are big agency and big holdcos. And there's sort of an investment being made right now in order to kind of chain our data together. And if you think about the explosion in focus on data capabilities that we're seeing in the agency space, right? You only have to look as far as the Epsilon acquisition by Publicis or the Axiom one by IPG to know that this is an important space moving forward, right? This is a thing that agencies are focused on, so we need to be able to interoperate with those databases, and then that's a place where infrastructure, where things like Snowflake really can come to play. And I would say that a lot of the focus in the industry over the last couple of years has been around interoperability, connection, etc. I think the thing that is exciting, right? And is exciting about AI and all these other sort of evolutions is that it builds on top of that original approach, right? Like once we've connected our data sets, now there's a way and there's a new set of technology that allows us to maximize the utility we get from that connection, to be able to learn as much as we can, not just from Paramount data or from our clients' data, but from that data combined. And to do so in a way that is relatively fast, right? And relatively easy compared to maybe how it used to be done historically. I think that's largely the biggest shift we're going to see. We're seeing most of our clients in some stage of that journey right now, to varying degrees, but I think it's almost universal that we're all on the same journey together.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our last area of inquiry, Travis, I'd like to ask you a little bit about culture, because you mentioned democratization, and that's not just about who can use data and how, but I think it's also in who has the skill sets in your organization and how can they become more data driven without becoming data scientists, if you will. So what is it about the culture of your organization there at Paramount that you think is important and beneficial when it comes to the adoption of more of these analytics generically or embedded across the company rather than one little office with a bunch of white coated people in it?
Yeah. So, I think the biggest cultural shift, I think, is for folks to realize that everything they do is data driven. Everybody's sort of a data scientist to begin with, right? And maybe historically, and in a lot of companies, folks don't necessarily think about it that way. So they think to themselves like, oh, the data stuff is tough. It's hard, right? It's a skill maybe some of those white coat guys have, but I'm in sales or I'm in whatever. That's not really the case. If you think about what data driven advertising is, or what data application data science really is, it's looking at a bunch of information around you, right? Understanding the patterns of that information and leveraging that to make a decision based on what you think is about to happen, right? Now, we all do that every single day, right? When we wake up, when I wake up, I'll give a great example. My hot water in my house, for some reason, it takes like 5 or 10 minutes to get hot. Now, look, I've learned that when I wake up in the morning, I need to turn the shower on before I brush my teeth, right? Because I need to give it a little bit of time. Well, that's me figuring out data, right? There was a historical track record of having to take cold showers, right? And then I learned from that and I said, okay, well, here's a solution to that problem. I can do a few other tasks while I let this wake up. And then now I can have a hot shower and all of my problems are solved before I even started my day. That is the application of data. That is data science, right? In my own personal home in the first few minutes after I wake up. Culturally, what I think is happening is that folks that previously thought that they weren't data scientists are realizing they really are, right? Because they've been doing that. And then they start to realize, well, I can just extend that concept to the things that the folks in the white coats are telling me, and I can apply that to how I have conversations with my clients. And all of a sudden, you have a data-driven culture, not because you're teaching everybody new skills, but you're just making them realize the skills they already had, and you're helping them harness it in a little bit of a different way. And then they start to see the impact of that. They start to see the impact of the decision-making, the client sort of delight as a result, and it just becomes a self-fulfilling flywheel.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to leave our discussion. Thank you so much to our latest Data Cloud podcast guest, Travis Scoles, Executive Vice President, Advanced Advertising at Paramount Global in New York. We so appreciate you sharing your thoughts, expertise, and experience, Travis.
Thank you very much for having me. This was great.